January 19th, 1945. Deep in the heart of Versailles, inside an office that once belonged to Napoleon Bonaparte himself, a man stands alone in front of a fireplace. The room is dark except for the dancing flames. In his hands, Supreme Allied Commander Dwight Eisenhower holds a stack of papers, official notes, meeting records, documents that detail a conversation that ended just 30 minutes ago, and one by one, he feeds them into the fire. His chief of staff, Walter Bedell Smith, watches from the doorway. He has known Eisenhower for years. He has seen him calm under impossible pressure. He has watched him manage egos bigger than small countries. But tonight, something is different. Tonight, Eisenhower is afraid. "Sir," Smith says quietly, breaking the silence, "are you absolutely certain about this?" Eisenhower does not turn around. He watches the papers curl and blacken in the flames. "Some conversations, Bedell," he finally says, "should never be recorded. Some things are too dangerous to exist on paper." What could be so explosive that the Supreme Commander of all Allied forces in Europe would destroy official military records? What words were spoken in that room that had to be erased from history? And why, when Joseph Stalin received word of this meeting just 12 hours later through his intelligence networks, did he smile? Not a polite smile, not a diplomatic smile, a genuine smile of satisfaction. The kind of smile that appears when your enemy has just made a mistake so catastrophic, so perfectly aligned with your interests, that you almost cannot believe your luck. Here is what we know. Here is what survived despite Eisenhower's attempt to burn it all away. That meeting in Versailles was not a friendly discussion between Allied commanders. It was not a strategic planning session. It was a confrontation so brutal, so absolute, that it would end one man's influence over American forces forever. It was the moment when Eisenhower, famous for his patience and his ability to hold together impossible coalitions, finally stopped being patient. But that is just the surface. Because buried in declassified archives, hidden in documents that have only come to light in the past few years, is a story far more disturbing than two generals having an argument. This was not about ego. This was not about military strategy. This was about espionage, about Soviet intelligence operations designed to tear apart the Western alliance from the inside, about a spy whose identity remains unknown to this day, a spy whose codename was Prince. And here is the part that should terrify you. Somewhere in a classified vault, possibly in the basement of CIA headquarters in Langley, there may exist an audio recording of that entire confrontation. The actual voices, the actual words. Everything Eisenhower tried to destroy. The Office of Strategic Services, against all protocols, against direct orders, may have recorded the whole thing. And if that recording exists, if the rumors are true, it is currently classified until the year 2045, 100 years after the event, which means we have 20 years left to wait. 20 years until we finally hear what really happened in that room, unless someone breaks their silence first. But before we get to that, before I show you the evidence that has emerged over 8 decades of declassification, let me tell you something about this channel. I do not make typical history videos. I do not recite dates and facts from textbooks. I dig into the classified documents. I track down the mysteries that governments tried to bury. And I bring you stories that will change the way you see the world. If that sounds like something you want to be part of, hit that subscribe button right now. Turn on notifications, because next week, I am bringing you something that might finally answer the biggest question from tonight's story. The identity of Prince, the Soviet spy who infiltrated Allied Command. And trust me, when you hear the evidence, when you see who the historians now believe it was, your jaw is going to hit the floor. So do not miss it. Now, back to Versailles. Back to that burning fireplace. Back to the question that has haunted intelligence agencies and historians for 80 years. What was said in that room? What did those documents contain? And why did Stalin smile? To answer that, we need to go back 12 hours earlier, to the moment when Soviet intelligence officer Vladimir Karpov sat in a small apartment in Paris, decoding an urgent message from his agent inside Allied headquarters. The agent with the codename Prince, and the message contained 4 words that would change everything. The confrontation happens tonight. Stalin knew, before Montgomery even walked into that office, before Eisenhower made his decision, before any of it happened, Stalin knew. which means someone at the highest levels of Allied command was feeding information directly to Moscow, and that person was never caught. The spy hunt began the morning after the Versailles confrontation. But what most people do not know is that it started too late, because by the time Eisenhower ordered his counterintelligence team to investigate the leak, Prince had already sent his final report to Moscow. The damage was done, and the trail had gone cold. Let me show you how deep this conspiracy actually went, because this was not just one spy feeding information to Stalin. This was a coordinated Soviet intelligence operation that had been running since September of 1944. The KGB code name for the entire operation was GUSTAV, and its objective was simple: widen the rift between British and American commanders, delay the Western advance into Germany, give Soviet forces time to reach Berlin first, and dominate post-war Europe. The operation worked better than Moscow could have dreamed. And the man at the center of it all, whether he knew it or not, was Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, Britain's most celebrated general, a tactical genius, a victor of North Africa, and a man whose ego would nearly hand Stalin everything he wanted. Montgomery's campaign to seize control of Allied forces did not start with that press conference in January of 45. It started 5 months earlier, right after Operation Market Garden crashed and burned in the Netherlands. Montgomery had designed that operation. He had promised Eisenhower it would end the war by Christmas. Instead, it became one of the costliest Allied failures of the entire war. Thousands of paratroopers dead or captured, the British 1st Airborne Division destroyed, the bridge at Arnhem never taken. Any reasonable commander would have accepted responsibility, would have admitted the plan was flawed. But Montgomery was not any reasonable commander. Instead, he blamed Eisenhower. He blamed American logistics. He blamed everyone except himself. And then he started his campaign. Secret meetings with members of the British War Cabinet. Dinner conversations with American generals, where he subtly questioned Eisenhower's competence. Carefully worded comments to British journalists about how the war should really be run. Montgomery was waging a shadow war for control of the Allied offensive. And he genuinely believed he was right, believed he was the only man who truly understood how to defeat Germany. Here is where it gets dark, because KGB records, declassified in 1991, reveal that Soviet intelligence agents were actively amplifying Montgomery's criticisms. They fed stories to British newspapers. They created fake reports about American complaints regarding British leadership. They made sure every disagreement between Montgomery and Eisenhower reached the press. They turned what could have been private military disputes into public scandals that threatened the entire alliance. And they had help from inside Allied headquarters, from Prince. We know Prince existed because the Soviet files reference him repeatedly. We know he had access to high-level meetings because his reports contain details that only a handful of people could have known. We know he was never caught because there is no record of any arrest, any trial, any punishment. The investigation simply stopped, quietly, with no explanation. Why? 3 theories have emerged over the decades. Theory 1. They found Prince, but he was too high-ranking to prosecute without destroying Allied morale. Theory 2. Prince was extracted to the Soviet Union before they could catch him. Theory 3. And this is the one that keeps intelligence historians up at night. There was not just one spy, there were 2. One British, one American, working together. Professor John Keegan spent the last years of his life investigating this case. His conclusion, published in 2004, was blunt. Prince was never caught because the people running the investigation were protecting him, either consciously or because they could not believe someone they trusted completely could be a traitor. Dr. Antony Beevor went further. In his analysis of Soviet intelligence operations, he argued that Stalin had multiple sources inside Allied command, that Prince was just the most valuable, that the entire command structure had been compromised at levels we still do not fully understand. And then in 2023, a Russian historian named Dmitry Volkov made a startling claim at a conference in Moscow. He said he knows who Prince was. He has seen evidence in archives that remain sealed, but he will not reveal the name. Not yet. Not until, in his words, certain people have died. When pressed by Western journalists, he would only say this: "It is someone everyone trusts, someone whose name appears in every major history of the war, and when the truth comes out, it will rewrite everything." So who was it? Who was Prince? That is the mystery we are still trying to solve. But here is what we know for certain. On the night before the Versailles confrontation, Prince sent a detailed report to Moscow. He told them about Bradley's threat to resign, about Churchill giving Eisenhower permission to fire Montgomery, about the ultimatum that was coming. Stalin knew everything. And 12 hours after Eisenhower burned those documents, Stalin was smiling. Because even though Montgomery had been silenced, even though the immediate crisis was over, the damage to Allied unity was permanent. American and British commanders would never fully trust each other again, and that mistrust would shape the entire post-war world. By the way, I am curious, where are you watching this from right now? And what time is it where you are? Drop a comment and let me know. I always wonder who is out there diving into these stories with me. Picture Montgomery walking into that office at Versailles. 8 o'clock in the evening. He has done this walk dozens of times before. Same hallway, same guards nodding as he passes. Same expectation that this will be another strategic discussion where he can press his case, argue his points, maybe win a few concessions from Eisenhower. He has no idea what is waiting for him behind that door. Eisenhower is standing when Montgomery enters, not sitting behind his desk like usual. Standing, arms crossed, and the expression on his face is something Montgomery has never seen before. Not anger, exactly. Something colder than anger. Something final. Before Montgomery can even offer a greeting, Eisenhower speaks. His voice is low, controlled, but there is steel underneath every word. Your remarks to the press have caused serious damage to Allied unity. American generals are furious. American newspapers are calling for your removal, and I am not entirely sure I disagree with them. Montgomery tries to respond, tries to explain that he was praising American troops, that the journalists misunderstood his meaning, that this is all a terrible misunderstanding. But Eisenhower raises one hand. The gesture is small, simple, but its meaning is absolutely clear. Silence. I do not care about your intentions. Eisenhower continues. I care about results. And the result is that you have made every American officer in this command question whether we are truly partners or whether we are just here to provide men and equipment for British glory. The temperature in the room drops. Montgomery, a man accustomed to deference, to respect for his rank and his victories, suddenly understands this is not a discussion. This is something else entirely. This is a reckoning. According to K. Summersby, Eisenhower's personal secretary, who was stationed just outside the office, Montgomery's face turned bright red. She could not hear the words being spoken, but she could see through the partially open door, could see Montgomery's posture change, could see the moment he realized how much trouble he was actually in. Eisenhower walked to his desk, picked up a piece of paper, held it for a moment. Then he said the words that would end Montgomery's influence over American forces forever. You seem to believe you should be running this campaign. You have made that abundantly clear in every conversation we have had since September. So let me make something equally clear to you right now. You are not running this campaign. I am. And if you cannot accept that fact, if you cannot fall in line and support my decisions without complaint, then I will personally ask Winston Churchill to relieve you of your command. 23 minutes. That is how long the meeting lasted according to Bedell Smith's watch. 23 minutes that changed the entire dynamic of Allied command for the rest of the war. What happened in those 23 minutes? We have fragments, pieces, testimony from people who were nearby, letters written years later. But we do not have the complete picture because Eisenhower burned it, literally turned it to ash. But here is what we can reconstruct. Eisenhower did not just threaten Montgomery, he had proof. Transcripts of Montgomery's conversations with British journalists, copies of letters Montgomery had sent to the War Cabinet criticizing Eisenhower's strategy, reports from American generals documenting every instance where Montgomery had undermined command decisions. Eisenhower had been building a case for months, and that night in Versailles, he laid it all out. Montgomery tried to defend himself, tried to argue that his criticisms were professional disagreements, not personal attacks, that his suggestions were meant to save lives, not grab power. But Eisenhower had one more card to play. A telegram from George Marshal, the Army Chief of Staff back in Washington. The telegram was brief, direct. It gave Eisenhower full authority to remove any commander, regardless of nationality, if that commander threatened Allied unity, even a British Field Marshal. Montgomery read that telegram, and according to his own letters to Field Marshal Alan Brooke, written weeks later, that was the moment he understood he had lost. Not just this argument. Everything. His influence, his reputation, his vision for how the war should be won. All of it, gone. Eisenhower slid a document across the desk. Montgomery picked it up. Read it. His hand was shaking. It was a formal statement, an apology, a public declaration of support for Eisenhower's leadership, a promise to never speak to the press without prior approval. And at the bottom, a line from Montgomery's signature. For a long moment, Montgomery just stared at that piece of paper. This was a man who had accepted the surrender of German forces in North Africa, who had planned the invasion of Sicily, who had commanded armies across Europe, and now he was being asked to sign what amounted to a confession of insubordination. But he had no choice. Churchill had already told him privately, fall in line or come home in disgrace. The Americans were done with him, and Britain needed the alliance more than it needed Montgomery's pride. He signed. The pen scratching across paper was the only sound in the room. Eisenhower took the document, looked at it, then did something Montgomery did not expect. He fed it into the fireplace, along with everything else, the transcripts, the letters, the reports, the telegram from Marshal, all of it burned. This meeting never happened, Eisenhower said. As far as history is concerned, we had a productive discussion about future operations, nothing more. Montgomery left that office a different man than the one who walked in. 12 hours after that meeting ended, a coded telegram arrived at the Kremlin. The message was brief, just 4 sentences. But those 4 sentences told Stalin everything he needed to know. Montgomery had been broken. Eisenhower had won. The rift between British and American command was now permanent, and the path to Berlin was wide open for Soviet forces. Stalin's response was documented by his personal secretary, who recorded it in a diary that would not surface until 2007. Stalin stood up from his desk, walked to the window overlooking Red Square, and said something his secretary had never heard him say before. The capitalists have done our work for us. But here is the question nobody could answer then and nobody can answer now. How did Moscow know so fast? The meeting was secret. The documents were burned. Eisenhower and Montgomery had agreed to tell no one what really happened. Yet somehow, before the sun rose over Paris, before Montgomery had even returned to his headquarters, Stalin had a detailed report sitting on his desk. Prince, the spy who was never caught, the source who remains unnamed, the person who had access to the most sensitive conversations in Allied command and used that access to feed information directly to Soviet intelligence. And what makes this truly disturbing is not just that Prince existed, it is that the investigation into Prince's identity was deliberately sabotaged. Let me walk you through what happened next, because this is where the story gets genuinely sinister. February of 1945. 3 weeks after the Versailles meeting, Eisenhower quietly orders a counterintelligence investigation. He tells only 3 people: his chief of staff, Bedell Smith, the head of OSS operations in Europe, and 1 British intelligence officer, whose name remains redacted in every declassified document. The investigation is given unlimited resources, unlimited authority, and 1 objective: find the leak. They start with a list of everyone who could have known about the meeting in advance. 17 names, 11 American, 6 British, all of them vetted, all of them trusted, all of them with impeccable records of service. The investigators conduct interviews, review communications, track movements, and they find something. One of the 17 had made an unusual trip to Paris the day before the meeting. This person claimed it was personal business, a meeting with a French liaison officer about logistics. But the French officer in question has no record of any such meeting, and when investigators dig deeper, they discover this person stayed at a small hotel in the Latin Quarter, the same hotel where a known Soviet intelligence officer had been spotted 3 times in the previous month. The investigators prepare their report. They are ready to make an arrest, and then something inexplicable happens. The investigation is shut down. No explanation, no warning, just an order from someone high up in the command chain. Case closed. Move on. Focus on winning the war. The lead investigator, an Army counterintelligence officer named Robert Clayton, was furious. He wrote a memo protesting the decision. That memo was classified until 2015. In it, Clayton argues that shutting down the investigation is a betrayal of every soldier fighting for the Allied cause, and that whoever gave this order is either incompetent or complicit. Clayton's memo disappeared into a classified file. He was quietly transferred to a desk job in London, and the investigation into Prince died. But Clayton never forgot. After the war ended, he spent years trying to get the case reopened. He contacted the FBI. He reached out to British MI5. He wrote letters to congressmen. Nobody would listen. And in 1953, Clayton died in a car accident. The official report called it mechanical failure. His family called it suspicious. But by then, the Cold War was in full swing, and nobody wanted to reopen questions about wartime espionage. Fast forward to 1991. The Soviet Union collapses. KGB archives start opening up. Historians rush to Moscow to dig through decades of classified intelligence files. And buried in a subsection labeled Western Front Operations, they find the GUSTAV files. Hundreds of pages documenting Soviet efforts to exploit Allied divisions. And right there, referenced repeatedly across multiple reports, is Prince. The files describe Prince as invaluable. They detail the kind of information he provided: meeting notes, strategic plans, personal conflicts between commanders. Everything Moscow needed to understand exactly where the cracks in the Allied coalition were and how to widen them. But the files never mention his real name. Just the code name. Just Prince. Historians have been trying to identify him ever since, and they have narrowed it down, based on the level of access Prince had, based on the timing of his reports, based on the specific details he could provide. It has to be someone from that original list of 17. Someone who was in the room or close enough to it that they knew everything that mattered. 3 names keep coming up in academic circles. I am not going to say them here because without proof, naming names would be irresponsible. But I will tell you this. All 3 are people whose names you would recognize. All 3 went on to distinguished post-war careers. All 3 are dead now. And all 3 have descendants who would be devastated if the truth came out. Which brings us back to Dmitry Volkov, the Russian historian who claims he knows, who says he has seen evidence that has not been declassified in the West, who refuses to speak until certain people die. When asked why he will not just reveal the name, he gave an answer that should chill you. Because the family is still powerful. Because the implications go beyond one person. Because if I am right, it means we have to rewrite our entire understanding of how the Cold War began. What does that mean? What could be so explosive about Prince's identity that it would rewrite history? One theory. Prince was not just feeding information to Moscow during the war. He continued afterward, during the early Cold War, during the formation of NATO, during the division of Europe. And if that is true, then decisions we thought were made by the West might have been influenced by Soviet intelligence all along. That is speculation. But it is speculation based on fragments of evidence that keep emerging every few years. 1974. Richard Nixon has just resigned. Watergate has taught Americans that secrets do not stay buried forever. And on a quiet afternoon in October, a steel vault in the National Archives opens for the first time in 30 years. Inside are the personal papers of General Omar Bradley, released according to the terms of his will. Historians gather. They expect tactical reports, maybe some interesting anecdotes about the war. What they find instead rewrites the entire narrative of Allied command. Bradley hated Montgomery. That much everyone knew. But the depth of that hatred, the specific threats he made, the resignation letter he actually drafted and showed to Eisenhower, that was new. That was explosive. And it confirmed something historians had only suspected. The alliance came within days of complete collapse. One researcher, a graduate student named Patricia Morrison, finds a memo dated January 17, 45, 2 days before the Versailles meeting. Bradley's handwriting is sharp, angry. The memo is addressed to Eisenhower, but marked not sent. It reads, "If Montgomery is given command of American forces, I will resign immediately, and I will make sure every newspaper in the United States knows exactly why. The American people will not tolerate their sons dying under British incompetence." Morrison sits there in the reading room, holding this piece of paper, and realizes she is looking at evidence of a constitutional crisis that almost happened. Because if Bradley had resigned, if that story had gone public, Roosevelt would have faced enormous political pressure. Congress would have gotten involved. The entire command structure could have shattered. But Bradley never sent that memo. Because 2 days later, Eisenhower handled it, and the crisis was averted. Barely. Fast forward to 1991, the Soviet Union collapses. KGB headquarters in Moscow is chaos. Officers are shredding documents, burning files, trying to erase 70 years of espionage operations before Western intelligence can get their hands on the evidence. But they miss some, and what they miss changes everything. A British historian named Christopher Andrew gains access to a small collection of files that a KGB archivist smuggled out. Among them is a folder marked GUSTAV, Operation GUSTAV, and inside that folder is a timeline that makes your blood run cold. Soviet intelligence did not just watch the Montgomery-Eisenhower conflict. They orchestrated parts of it. They identified Montgomery's ambition, his resentment, his certainty that he knew better, and they exploited it. Specific operations are listed. Payments to journalists to write articles questioning Eisenhower's competence. Forged memos designed to look like American generals were complaining about British leadership. Anonymous letters sent to British MPs suggesting that Churchill was letting America dominate the war effort. All of it designed to widen the crack in Allied unity. All of it working exactly as planned. But here is the detail that stops Andrew cold. A notation dated January 18th, 45, the night before the Versailles meeting. It reads, "Prince reports confrontation scheduled for tomorrow evening. Subject believes he will prevail. Moscow directive. Do nothing. Let them destroy each other." Subject, not Montgomery, not Eisenhower. Subject, which means Prince was talking about someone else entirely, or he was referring to one of them in code. Either way, this is proof that Soviet intelligence knew about the meeting before it happened. That they had someone close enough to know Eisenhower's plans. Someone trusted enough to have access to scheduling. Someone who has never been identified. 2001 brings Montgomery's letters to Alan Brooke. These are different from anything released before. These are raw, unfiltered, written in the immediate aftermath of events when emotion overrides discretion. One letter, dated January 25th, 45, 6 days after Versailles, contains this passage. "Ike has humiliated me in a way I cannot forgive. He stood there with absolute certainty, absolute power, and he crushed me like I was nothing. And the worst part, Alan, the truly unbearable part, is that he was right to do it. I have been a fool, a vain, arrogant fool who let his pride endanger everything we are fighting for." Historians reading this are stunned, because Montgomery admitting he was wrong, Montgomery accepting blame, that never happened publicly, not once in his entire post-war career. But here, in a private letter to his closest friend, he confesses everything. 2003. The Eisenhower Presidential Library releases the final collection from Ike's personal papers. Most of it is routine, correspondence with family, notes about his presidency, but there is one letter that stands out. Written in 1952 to his brother Milton, Eisenhower is reflecting on the war, on decisions he made, and he writes, "I sometimes wonder if I was too hard on Monty that night in Versailles. He was difficult, yes, impossible at times. But he was also brilliant, and I broke something in him that I am not sure needed to be broken. Perhaps I could have found another way." This is the victor expressing regret, the man who won the confrontation, wondering if the cost was too high, and it humanizes both of them in a way the official histories never could. But the biggest revelation is still coming. 2023. A historian named Jennifer Wade is researching something completely different when she finds a reference in a footnote in a declassified State Department memo from 1946. It mentions something called the Vienna Protocol, an informal agreement between Churchill, Eisenhower, and Montgomery, never to discuss publicly what happened in Versailles, never to write about it in their memoirs, never to give historians the full story. All three men honored that agreement until they died, which means everything we know, everything we have pieced together from fragments and letters and declassified files, it is still incomplete. The full truth died with them, unless that recording exists, unless somewhere in a vault the actual voices are waiting. 20 more years until we know. Think about the leaders you know, the managers you have worked for, the politicians you vote for, the people running companies, running countries, running military operations today. How many of them face the exact same challenge Eisenhower faced that night in Versailles? Someone brilliant but impossible. Someone whose talent is undeniable but whose ego threatens everything. Someone who cannot accept they are not in charge. NATO headquarters in Brussels. 2024. Generals from 32 nations trying to coordinate a response to Russian aggression. Different languages, different military traditions, different political pressures from back home, and underneath it all, the same fundamental tension. Who is really in command? Whose strategy prevails? Whose national interest gets prioritized? The names have changed, the weapons are different, but the dynamics are identical to what Eisenhower managed 80 years ago. Corporate boardrooms face it constantly. The brilliant executive who delivers results but undermines the CEO at every turn, who leaks to the press, who builds coalitions against leadership decisions, who genuinely believes their vision is superior. Every CEO eventually has their Montgomery moment, that point where patience becomes weakness, where tolerating disruption becomes enabling destruction. The lesson is not that confrontation is always the answer. Eisenhower did not want that meeting. He spent months trying every other option: diplomacy, mediation, private conversations, compromise. He absorbed criticism. He deflected blame. He made himself the target so others could work together. But eventually, he reached a point where the only options left were absolute clarity or complete collapse. That is leadership. Knowing the difference between productive tension and destructive chaos. Recognizing when someone's ego has crossed from confidence into sabotage. Having the courage to draw a line and enforce it, even when it costs you politically, even when it damages relationships, even when it makes you look like the bad guy. Montgomery never learned that lesson. His tactical brilliance was real. His victories were genuine. His understanding of mobile warfare was ahead of his time. But brilliance without humility is just arrogance. Being right about strategy does not give you permission to undermine your commander. And Montgomery could not see that distinction. He died, believing he had been wronged, that history would vindicate him, that Eisenhower's approach was wasteful and inefficient. Maybe he was right about some of that, but he was catastrophically wrong about what mattered most. Wars are not won by the best plan. They are won by unified execution of a good enough plan. And unity requires someone to be in charge, requires everyone else to fall in line, requires egos to bend. Here's the part that haunts me. That letter Montgomery wrote to Mamie Eisenhower in '69 after Ike died. He was 81 years old, retired, forgotten by a world that had moved on. And in that private letter, he wrote, "I wish I had been more worthy of his patience." That is as close as he ever came to admitting he was wrong. And it came too late. Eisenhower was already gone. They never reconciled, never had that conversation. Two men who helped save the world from fascism, and they died without resolving what happened between them. The human cost of pride, the relationships we damage because we cannot admit we are wrong until it is too late. But maybe, just maybe, we are about to get the complete story. Because if those rumors are true, if that OSS recording exists, then in 2045, the vault opens. We will hear their actual voices, the actual words. Everything Eisenhower tried to burn will come back from the dead. Or maybe we will not have to wait that long, because someone out there knows more than they are saying. That Russian historian who claims to know Prince's identity. The intelligence agencies that keep denying freedom of information requests on national security grounds 80 years after the fact. The last living people who heard the stories from their grandparents who were actually there. Secrets do not stay buried forever. Watergate taught us that. The Pentagon Papers taught us that. WikiLeaks taught us that. Eventually someone talks. Eventually someone decides the truth matters more than the protocol. Eventually we find out, and when we do, when that last piece of the puzzle finally surfaces, everything we think we know about World War II leadership might change. The heroes might look different. The villains might look different. The entire narrative might shift. That is why these stories matter, not because they happened 80 years ago, but because they are still happening, right now, in Brussels, in Washington, in boardrooms and parliaments and military headquarters around the world. People are facing their Montgomery moment, and the question is always the same. Do you have the courage to do what Eisenhower did? Do you know when to stop being patient and start being definitive? History does not repeat, but it rhymes. And if you listen carefully, you can hear the rhythm. If you made it this far, if you care about the untold stories that shape our world, do me a favor. Subscribe to this channel. Not because I need the numbers, though I will not pretend they do not help, but because next week I am bringing you something that might crack this case wide open. new evidence about Prince's identity, a source who has agreed to speak on record for the first time, and a theory that connects this story to intelligence operations still classified today. Hit that notification bell if you want to be there when it drops. Or do not. Either way, I will be here, digging into the mysteries they tried to bury. Thanks for watching. See you next time.